let me show you a few basic ways to apply paint. Okay, let's do some wet on dry, the simplest technique, and I'm just going to show you on a back of a junk piece of paper. So keep junk pieces of paper around, keep failed paintings. You can practice things on the back of them if you're using decent 100% cotton watercolor paper. All right, so first we're going to do wet on dry. So I'm going to use my bamboo brush. This brush really splays nicely, and so you can get it wet. You can squeeze out the excess, or you can shake your brush like that. You can splay your bristles, and then you can pick up some paint. So that's a pure orange. Let's make it a little bit more of a fur color by adding a tiny bit of blue. So that's what we call about milk consistency. There's different consistencies of paint you can use. Add a little tiny bit of water if you want a dark, rich color. Add a little bit more water to get milk consistency for a medium valued color. Add a lot of water that's very, very drippy to your mix for tea consistency, which will dry really light. So the more water you add to your paint, the lighter it will dry. And watercolor goes through a drying shift. So as it dries, it lightens and grays down a little bit. So, okay, so that's a little bit of a dry brush because I don't have a lot of water in my brush. So do you see how that looks like almost perfect fur texture? Because I'm using a fast, swishy motion, and that's what's so great about this brush. It just gives you a lot of texture. And then if you want to, say you think, oh, that looks too harsh, that looks too hard, you can get a second clean brush with drippy water in it. I'm going to squeeze out the excess, so now I kind of have a damp brush, and you can touch it here and there and soften it as long as it's still wet. Okay, so you can soften things up if you think that has too much texture, or you can go in with a drippy brush and watch what will happen as it interacts. I went in with a drippy brush on half dry paint. That gives you what we call cauliflowers. But in fur, that can look good. It can just give it a fur texture. So you see how that's kind of softening things. Okay. Another way I often like to paint is get everything wet like this. And you don't want puddles, and you want the paint to be evenly distributed, so you can run your brush across it both ways and just rub it around and make sure that it's evenly distributed. And then for this technique, you want a little bit thicker paint because once it hits this, it'll be more diluted, right? So I'm going to mix in a little bit of blue for a more fur texture look, and see how that just blooms out softly, right? So that's another way to get some value down, some color down on your paper if you want it to look smoother especially. Let's try a different brush that you guys might not have this, and that's okay. So let's try another way of painting fur. I'm going to get some about milk consistency. So you can kind of swish it on like that. Or you can blot like that and then use the side of your size 8 round to, again, use the side of the bristles in a fast swishy motion. That's dry brush. And that looks very furry. And if you want to loosen it up, you can take a wet brush. I'm going to get this wet, wring out the excess water, and then just touch some of the edge to soften some of the edge if I want to. Okay, so that's kind of how you can work with different values. Now, this is going into what we call buckling. As the water absorbs into the paper, it goes into buckling. I just got a bunch of red on my finger. Let me change that orientation. See, I'm such a klutz. So anyway, as this goes into buckling, you can see the paper start to warp because the water is, it's melting into the paper. It's absorbing into the paper. This is when you can get cauliflowers if you go in with too drippy a brush. Let's see. Yep. See, I'm putting in cauliflowers. Or you can, one of my favorite techniques is when it's this stage of moisture, I'll splat water into it for a very textured look. So that's cauliflowering. And sometimes you don't want cauliflowers, and sometimes in fur especially, it looks nice when you let that happen. This is getting dry. This won't cauliflower anymore. This is probably dry too. I think this feels pretty dry. It dried pretty fast. But this was perfect. And then look how textured that looks. Okay. Now, okay, so say this is all dry, right? This is dry. It's pretty much set. Once everything is completely dry, if you want to get this darker, and this is the classic way to work in watercolor, is do a layer, let it dry, and then put more paint on top of it. And the bottom layers are kind of, because watercolor is a transparent medium, it will shine up through your brush marks. Okay, so now I just made that a little bit darker. And you want to put your brightest color down first because as this dries, the grayer color underneath it will gray this orange down. Okay. That's how you can build up texture in fur. You can put down a layer, let it dry. Put another layer, let it dry. And then when this half dries, if we get it at the right moment, we can splat at it again and get more texture. Like, look how pretty these textures look. And then as this is drying more, you can splat more. And it might even make more textures if you hit it at just the right amount of dryness. And it does take a little bit of luck to get it at the right amount of dry stage. If it's a little drier damp, you'll get harder cauliflowers. If it's more wet damp, you'll get softer cauliflowers. So it's all, a lot of watercolor when you're wanting to do cauliflowers like this is a waiting game. Okay, I'm going to splat water in this and see if we can get it to cauliflower more. Usually the second layer doesn't cauliflower as well. Oh, another thing that you can do that makes interesting textures. I'm trying to keep my paper out of the shadows. I'm going to move this so I don't have a shadow from that. I'm going to get my paper wet. I'm going to splay my bristles. I squeezed out the excess water, and I'm just going to kind of activate my paper by getting a few areas wet, and then you can go and get some, I'm just going to dip the tip of my brush in because I don't want too much water on my brush. And then you can just drop water into the area you got wet. Now say we want to add some interesting effects by adding another color. I'm going to mix my orange with some cobalt blue now for a delicate gray. And then I'm going to put that here and there through this orange, and that'll make it look even more dynamic. And then as that's setting up, you can get thicker, even straight from the tube. I'm going to really rub my brush on this soft paint because it's wet now. And that's cream consistency. I can tip this up and that paint's not going to move. So that's really thick. And just play like this and see what happens when you do different things. Put really thick cream consistency. And that really makes a very bold, beautiful mark. And then as I get to the dry edge, look, it does dry brush. But where I've got the paper wet, it's soft. But when you go in with cream consistency paint on damp paper, it will soften, but the mark will hold its shape, right? See, this is still a little damp, so when I make a mark, now it makes, oh, no, it's dry. It's dry. It's making hard-edged. But if you get it at a damp, dry stage where it's still barely damp, you can make the most beautiful soft marks. Let me try to show you that. Okay, my brush is a little dirty. It doesn't matter. I'm going to get this a little damp, and then I'm going to try to be patient and let it dry. While that's drying, let's just play. And this is what you should be doing if you're brand new to painting. Just play. Now let's just do an experiment and see what happens if I splat water into this half dry. What happens if I take a drippy brush and draw a long line through it? What kind of mark does that make? Using clear, clean water, drip on my brush, pull it through, as opposed to if I drip. What if I put clear, clean water on this white dry area? Will it make a cool cauliflower? All right, this is getting dry now. This is damp dry, so let me show you what I wanted to with the cream consistency. Very thick paint. And in fact, I've seen an artist on one of her tutorials. She takes paint straight from the tube, and that seems to be a really nice, simple way. You could take, so that's what we call butter consistency, straight from the tube. And look, it makes a controlled mark, but it blooms out softly. Another thing to know is, okay, I'm going to get a little bit more watery paint now. Now, if I draw my brush through like that, it follows the line, right? It follows where I put the brush. But what if I go in and dab like this? That's going to make it explode out, and that might make you lose control. Like, say I'm painting the side of a cat, and I want the edge to be smooth. I don't want it to have blooms, blooms, blooms like this. That would look uncontrolled, right? If I draw it through the damp paper like that, it'll maintain that edge of the cat's, pretend this is the edge of the backside of a cat. That stays in an even edge, but it's soft, like the back of a cat or the back of any furry animal, right? And then you can look how much this is cauliflowering out. Now it's even more dry, but still damp. Now maybe, and it's always different every time, if I drop water into that, it'll make harder cauliflowers. And in fact, and indeed, now I'm getting really hard-edged cauliflowers because it's even drier damp than it was. So depending on how dry or damp your paper is how much it'll cauliflower. Don't get caught up in making this painting perfect. Get caught up in doing these kind of experiments. Ask yourself, what if I do this? And even if it ruins the painting, you learn something. You're going to learn more from your mistakes than your successes. So allow yourself to experiment and don't put so much pressure on these practice paintings. Put pressure on paintings when you're painting for money, for someone to pay you, but otherwise you should be experimenting. Art is about the joy of experimentation and discovery and just relaxation. It's not about making a perfect, beautiful painting. So don't try to do that to yourself.
Thank you so much for joining me on this video, and I hope you got a lot out of it. This footage that I just showed you of the fox is on hot press, and I will probably release it on my Patreon. I have a lot of paintings kind of piling up, and I haven't decided which one I'll turn into a tutorial, but I'll probably let my Patreon members vote. So be sure to join my Patreon for free because I put out a lot of free content, and you can also just stay in touch with me and see what I've been up to. And I also share free videos that I find on YouTube that I find helpful for myself. So we have a lot of fun over there. Join my Facebook group. You can post your paintings on my Facebook group and people will comment on them. And if you request a critique or help, people will be happy to offer that as well. So we have a lot of fun over there as well. And I hope to see you online. And until next time, go watercolor your world. Bye, everybody.